Europeans have been receiving gold, ivory, spices, and many things across the Mediterranean, initially from Arabs. After the Wars of Crusades, Christian Europe decided to come and find the source of the gold that has made the Arabs so rich and powerful. So they take the gold trade away from the Arabs and they use the profit to finance their war against them. They also wanted to combat Islam as a religion, which was spreading across the Sahara with the occupation of Morocco, Libya, Egypt, and the rest of North Africa by the Arabs. Therefore, Portugal took the lead. And by 1482, they put up a structure in Elmina, which they used as a base for their trading and evangelical activities. But soon after that, America was supposedly discovered. And Europeans moved to America to work on the plantations and the mines. But they soon realized that labor was a problem. So they decided to use Africans, whom with their long contact with, had realized that we are strong and robust. We could also withstand diseases. And most importantly, we are professional farmers. And so by the 1500s, the transatlantic slave trade was well underway, spearheaded by the Portuguese. But other European nations saw the profits coming to the Portuguese. So they all decided to come and take part in the trade, to also share in the profits. And when they came, they also put up these structures, castles, forts, etc., etc. These buildings were also described as ships at permanent anchor. Activities on it were just like the ship. So you have the cabin over the deck, etc., and the dungeons as parts of the deck. And so that is how the whole thing was composed. It may interest you to know that these buildings were not called castles. They called them barracoons or factories. Factories because they were meant to produce captives for their enslavement on the plantations. Or factories here. So in many historical books, you find the Elmina factory, Cape Coast factory, and Mabo factory, etc., etc. Now, this factory, as we see today, was started by the Swedish in around 1654. And it was initially built with timber. But a year after, they replaced it with stones and mud. And they called it Fort Carolsberg. They named it after King Charles X of Sweden. But in the first 10 years, it changed hands several times. The Swedish lost it to the Danes, who lost it to the Dutch, and finally the English captured it in 1664 and then developed it into this edifice as we have today over a period of about 300 years. And it was used mainly as a trading post, trading in gold, ivory, spices, and some slaves. This coincided with the Industrial Revolution. So many goods manufactured in Europe were brought here and used in the exchange for the local African products. Much later in years, when the slave trade was abolished, this facility served as a point where certain European ideas and cultural practices were introduced. And foremost of these was Christianity, and then formal education, then some state institutions developing from this. So we have the judiciary, the postal services, the security, and all, in fact, parliament, and many of such state institutions or institutions that form the pillar of the state developing through these facilities. So these facilities have served in diverse ways. Some may be positive, some may be negative, but they have all helped in shaping the present social, economic, and political development of this country. Therefore, in the course of the tour, we'll be talking about some of such issues. Right, so the role of these buildings in Ghana's political, social, and economic history is so important that it is captured in our national emblem as depicted on the wall over there. It is actually, I'm going to take you through that national emblem. It's actually a shield divided into four by a cross. There's a St. John's cross and the shield. These two were the symbols of the early crusaders who came to Ghana. And the Portuguese especially were Catholics, and as charged by the emperors and then the kings and queens of Europe, they came here to propagate the gospel. And so they have that as their symbol. By the top right corner of it is an edifice of a castle. Show the role these buildings have played in social, economic, and political development, as I earlier said. Opposite to that is a cross of a traditional sword and staff that shows the role of traditional authority in a modern political dispensation. Below that is a tree that signifies the rich vegetation resource we have as a country. Opposite that is a mining shaft that also represents the rich minerals in gold and currently oil and bauxite and many resources that this land is endowed with. Now, at the top of the shield are national colors: red, gold, and green. Red for the blood that was shed by our fathers to secure the land and its properties. Yellow for the gold that is endowed in it, and green for the vegetation in medicine, in food, in exportable wood products for furniture, housing, etc. And on top of the shield is a black star that represents the people who are supposed to rise up like the star to take charge of world affairs. And therefore we find people like Kofi Annan, we find people like very important Jacob Osensei and all those people who have taken charge of affairs in situations that have made our country as it is now. Now, flanking the shield are two eagles with the national colors and the black star around their neck. Now, the eagles represent our leaders who are supposed to have the foresight in protecting the resources that we are endowed with. You understand? The eagle has a foresight. It can see far, and it's also aggressive, protective of its own. And so our leaders are supposed to be aggressive and protective of the resources that we are endowed with. They are supposed to have a foresight in investing in these resources for posterity. You understand? As we often say, John Shekan, think, look ahead. So our leaders are supposed to think, look ahead, and not use or abuse the resources for the present generation. It's more belong to the future generation than to us as a people. Good. Now, in the middle of the cross is a lion. That represents the colonial governors, the British colony, which has the lion. So we, as members of the Commonwealth of States, that is our symbol. And we also go by the motto freedom and justice. We believe that with freedom we can protect and have development. And also, we cannot have freedom without justice. Justice cements, it gives everybody fair advantage over whatever resources we have, so that no one can cheat anyone over whatever resource that's at their disposal. So we came through, this is the first point, our cars are parked out here. We came through this building and we are currently here. This is where we discuss the national emblem. We are here now. Currently, we're going to go through the male dungeon. It encompasses all this section of the dungeon, of the facility. This is the male dungeon. We're going to go through it. There's a tunnel from the male dungeon. We will not be able to go through that, but we will walk on top of it as when we come out. And then we're going to go visit the female dungeons, which encompasses the portion of this site, and then go through the door of no return through to the ocean exit points where the captives were loaded onto the ships. When we come back, we're going to visit the female dungeons. We're going to visit the cell, condemned cell here. And in the courtyard, we can see some couple of graves that are buried. Shows that people are buried there. A lot of people buried in the whole courtyard. We also talk about that, and then we look at the structure from this point, from this either this angle or from this angle, where we can have very good photographs of it. But this was the barracks. This was the barracks where the soldiers stayed, because without the security, much of the trading activities, especially with regards to the slave trade, would not have been possible. And of course, there were a lot of gold in this facility as well, and therefore there was a need for constant security. Most of these were criminals in Europe who were brought here to keep order. So you can imagine the the kind of disorder rather in West Africa. This is the kind of arrow we are going to follow in the course of the tour and see how it goes. Good. So this was the male slave dungeon. This was not the first male slave dungeon. This was built in 1792, designed for 1,000 people. But as the trade went on, it was taking about 1,500 people and even more. We're going to go in to see how the captives survived in it. It's about 3 steps to the floor, which is slopey. It's advisable to walk on the left as we go in. So now we stepped on some of the original materials left in the dungeons by the captives, their feces, their blood, decomposed bodies, clothes, food, vomit, sweat, tears, and many things that were left in this dungeon. So I'll briefly switch off the lights. This was the condition in the dungeon. There were no lights. So the hole up there provided them with lights and ventilation. And the captives stayed here for about 3 months on the average. Whilst they were here, they urinated, they defecated, they vomited, they ate, and they slept here. Occasionally, they were let out to be fed and also to crack stones with cannonballs that were used in building the dungeons. A soldier supervised them from the top here. Sometimes, when the captives were in angry mood, food was thrown in from there. So they struggled for it here in their feces. Water came in, they cupped their hands to drink, or they suck each other's hair for water. Now, if you look up there, you find another hole. This was not meant to be seen, but it served as a big eye, a big ear, and a big mouth. It was used mainly by the domestic slaves. Some of these were those who were sick, those who were weak, those who were maimed and not strong enough to survive in the dungeons. They were used as servants in the castle. So some of them fetched firewood, fetched water, washed the clothes of the officials, and did all the odd jobs. But some were made to hide in there to listen to the conversations in the dungeon, to know if there were plots of escapes, if there were plots of rebellions or revolts. And all those who were implicated were held separately in the dungeon to the right. May we go into that place? This was the dungeon for the troublemakers, those who were inciting rebellions and instigating violence, those whom we may refer to as the freedom fighters. They were held here in chains. Look at the holes on the wall here. These held chains where they were held into. That's another one here, and another one on the side there. These channels on the floor served as a drainage for their feces and urine. So when it rains, most often depending on the direction of the wind, water came in through these holes to wash the floor. But the whole place got covered with filth, and many of them got sick and died here. See, the floor on which you are standing now has been excavated. They have removed much of the coverings on the floor. And as they were doing so, they found bones, they found shackles, they found branding instruments, and some ropes. See, some parts of the earth were tested. They contained blood, flesh, feces, and many of such. So they left a small portion of it here. See this way? Left a small portion of it here to probably tell the rest of the story. Now I'll fetch a bit of it for you see. This made up of feces, blood, decomposed bodies, clothes, food, vomit, sweat, tears, and many things that they might have left here in the dungeon. It's often said that walls have ears. Actually, they have ears, but they don't have mouth. Otherwise, these walls would have told us what happened here. They have been witnesses to these inhuman treatments for years. So as we walk out of this dungeon, we'll be walking on some of such remains. Ochina namiko. We continue through the rest of the dungeon. Samanazwa. Nipa ambechi bo beriko sumruko. So now we are walking on some of the remains, some of the feces, some of the blood, some decomposed bodies, clothes, food, vomit, and the drain runs through it. As it had. This part has not been excavated. We are still working on some of the original materials here. Ago. We are entering the sacred place, so I announce our presence. Right, now what we are standing before now is a shrine. Right, we believe in the Supreme Being as all people, but we also believe in worshiping Him through natural phenomena. So certain trees, rivers, mountains, and some stones are believed to have spirits behind them, and through these spirits we communicate with the Supreme Being. Now this shrine, or the spirit here is called Nanatabel. He was here before they started building these dungeons. In fact, the stones we see in the walls were quarried from this very site, which was the location of Nanatabel. But when they wanted to build the fort on it, the local people were prevented from coming here to worship. So they performed rituals and removed the spirit from here to the center of the town. 1973, when rituals were again performed and he was brought back. That's why we find a shrine here in the middle of a dungeon. It was not part of the dungeon system. Good. This space was, however, used as a sorting room, also as a dungeon. Yes, this was the exit point. So those captives that were leaving immediately were sorted out. Those who were not, and those who were sick, were separated from those who were leaving immediately. And behind this wall, there was a tunnel through which the captives were led to the exit. Do you understand? When we go out, we will look through the tunnel and also go through the exit. But when the trade was abolished, the authorities realized there were some merchants and officials who were secretly shipping captives through the dungeons. So the tunnel was sealed to stop that illegal trading activity here. And now the walls have been dedicated to the souls of our ancestors who passed through these dungeons as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. And indeed, researchers have come up with several figures regarding the number of Africans who arrived alive at their destination. Some claim about 10 million, 50 million, 20 million, up to about 100 million arrived alive. But this excludes all those who died across the Atlantic, those who were discarded in the ocean, those who died in these dungeons. We don't know the number of people who died in these dungeons. We also don't know the number of people who died on their way into the dungeons and in the many battles, wars, and raids to capture them. So we can just imagine the number of people who were involved in a trade that lasted for over 400 years. So every year, on the 31st of July, wreaths are laid here in their memory. In everlasting memory of the anguish of our ancestors, may those who died rest in peace. May those who returned find their roots. May humanity never again perpetrate such injustice against humanity. We, the living, vow to uphold this. This was placed there by the traditional authorities to serve as a reminder that never should we allow the brutalities and inhumanities in the dungeons to be perpetrated again, not only against black people, but all races of the world. And that's the message from this facility. So we hope you share this with your colleagues and friends who are not able to come here and encourage them to visit us as well. Now, so this was the magazine where gunpowders were held. Gunpowders and ammunitions were kept. This was sited strategically on top of the dungeon so that in case there was a rebellion among the captives that was beyond their control, they just set fire to it and blow it up. Right, so if we go back, we look at the dungeon where we came from, we find that right on top of it was a church. In fact, one of the cardinal principles for Europeans coming to West Africa was to introduce Christianity. They had heard of a Christian king by name Prester John. They hoped to meet with Prester John and form alliance with him and together crush the Arab forces in the north. But when they came, the profits from the slave trade overcame their religious interests. But there were missionaries always associated with their activities in the castle, and therefore they find a church. The official English church sponsored a group of missionaries here, called them Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. They were to teach boys how to read and write, how to do simple mathematics and some catechism. And ironically, their church sat comfortably on top of the male dungeon. That was where formal education began as well. Realizing the high death rates among Europeans, they decided to send boys from here to England to study. So they come back and teach their own people. Initially, 3 boys were sent, but 2 of them died in England. Only one survived and came back. And he worked here for about 50 years. When he died, he was buried here. The name was Reverend Philip Kweku. Reverend Philip Kweku was sent to England in around 1754, came back in 1766 as a missionary, a catechist, and a school teacher. And he helped open a lot of schools along the coast. And also, through his influence, other missionaries set up high schools. So by the time of his death till today, Cape Coast has been known as the citadel of education. Philip Kweku died in 1816 at the age of 75 and was buried here. And 17th October has been dedicated to him as Philip Kweku's Day. So pupils, teachers, family members, and the church congregate here for a memorial service. And that's when they bring this wreath and flowers here. Good. So if I see Philip Kweku, yes. This is from the boys' school, Philip Kweku Girls and Boys School. Right, so now we are on top of the tunnel from the male dungeon. As I told you of, this was the tunnel through which the captives were taken through to the exits. And on top of these were guns. These cannons were mounted here to defend the castle against pirates and other nationals who tried to capture it. Because the trade here was very lucrative and it attracted all sorts of interests. For instance, this castle was tied by the Swedish in around 1654. In 1658, it was captured by the Danes. They lost it to the Dutch in 1662, and the English captured it in 1664. In between that, the local people held it on some occasions, right? But in 1664, the English captured it. In fact, this castle has a direct historical relationship with New York. I say New York used to be a Dutch colony, just at the same time as this was in the Dutch property. They called it New Amsterdam. In 1664, the English captured it and renamed it New York. That was at the same time they captured this castle also from the Dutch. Indeed, they captured Suriname, they captured Shamar, Dieskov, Axim, and many other places from the Dutch. The following year, the Dutch attempted to regain their possessions. They couldn't capture Cape Coast, neither could they capture New Amsterdam. But they succeeded in capturing an English fort. As you came from Accra, you probably saw a fort on a hill, Amsterdam. Yes, that was the first English fort in West Africa. And they called it Fort York. In 1665, the Dutch captured it and renamed it Fort Amsterdam to compensate for the loss of New Amsterdam to the English. So what I'm trying to say is that the coast of West Africa featured prominently on international politics and trade. And it continues to do so even now that we found oil on our shore. So if you agree with me, we can describe this as an international trading center. It was an international trading center that was part of an international trading system that laid the foundations for the present-day international trading systems and networks across the globe. So below it were the warehouses. Below it were the warehouses for the incoming goods and outgoing ones. The guns and gunpowder, second-hand clothes, tobacco, alcohol, and many items that were brought in were held there. Apart from these, gold, ivory, spices, and many cultural and religious artifacts that were being shipped out, held here before they were taken away. Above it were the rooms for the merchants and officials. So they call that the gentleman's room. And on top of that is what we call the Palaver Hall. The Palaver Hall, that was where meetings were held, where war plans were drawn, peace agreements signed. I'm sure you have heard of the Bond of 1844. That was where it was signed. It also served as the hall where the captives were auctioned. So when a captive arrived here for the first time, a strong man like my friend here, for instance, captive they were examining him like this. So a strong man like this, for instance, may go for about 12 guns, about 4 kegs of gunpowder, 6 bottles of whiskey or schnapps, some second-hand clothes, tobacco, alcohol, and many items in a package. Then the buyer smeared the upper right arm here with palm oil, and he'll be branded with the initials of the merchant, agent, or company. So you may have JSS, John Smith's slave, printed there. So from there, the men were separated from the women and sent into their separate dungeons. Thank you very much. Ochina namiko howe samanazwa nipa ambechi bo biriko sumriko. Now, before that dungeon we visited was constructed, the captives were kept here. These were the original dungeons. Dungeon was built in 1792. Before 1792, the captives were kept in these dungeons. Yes. You remember Bob Marley has a song, they call it a redemption song. It's the old pirates, yes, they rob I, sold I to the merchant ships. Minutes after they took I from the bottomless pits. These are the bottomless pits he's talking about. It was designed for about 500 people, but it was taken about 600 to 800. So they expanded it in 1792, which was the height of the transatlantic slave trade, and expanded it into 1,000+ dungeon for the captives. They later reconstructed this designed it as a well to store additional rainwater for the use by the captives. Yes, it was later redesigned as a system to store rainwater for the use by the captives.
Old pirates, yes, they rob I, sold I to the merchant ships. Minutes after they took I from the bottomless pit.
We are looking through the tunnel from the male dungeon. I told you that when the captives were ready to leave, they sorted them out at a point and led them through a tunnel. This was the tunnel we are looking through. A soldier stood here to supervise them as they moved along, so that to identify if anybody was fidgeting with their shackles, if anybody was, just to put fear also in the captives as they moved on. So that was just to make sure everything was intact. Yes, monitoring the movement of the goods. Yeah. So now we are at the end of the tunnel. This portion is also sealed. And it was sealed and the space used as a warehouse in addition to this. That was when this entrance was enlarged. But then it had a small door that allowed one captive out at a time. So when they stepped out, they were chained. They waited in line till they got a sizable group. Then they were marched through that door. So that door became known as the door of no return. Because anyone who went through it was not expected to come back. Yes, it was a door of no return. We will go through it, but we'll come back. But this was the cell for the female captives who were troublesome. Some of the female captives were also very troublesome as the men. And those of them were held here, particularly those whom they wanted to sexually abuse. Yes, some of them were held in this dungeon. They were fed through this hole, and there was a door that locked them up. Yeah. Right, so now we are entering the female dungeons, and as you can see, there was a gate here, but this hinges of a gate that's enclosed behind the women and children. And these dungeons held between 500 and 800 women and children. Yes. The average age was between 13 and 30. So from 10 to 40 and 45 were all taken. Even old men with gray hair like myself were shaven and were polished with palm oil to make us look strong and healthy. You see, that's why in books you see black people shining. Have you noticed that? Yes, yes. We always shine because you have been polished to make us look strong and healthy, even before living. Now we are in one of the dungeons for the women, and they live there in the same conditions as the men, probably worse than what we experienced in the male dungeon, as we can see. But one significant thing I may want to point to you here was this door that is sealed. You can see it conspicuously. Through it, the soldiers, the officers and men came in to select the women. They washed them and raped them, and after brought them back. And all those women that were found to be pregnant in the dungeons were taken out. There were stone houses with hired mistresses whose business was to take care of such women. And so after they delivered, they brought them back. The babies were left behind. Most of them died. But the few that survived from the core of the castle schools I mentioned to you earlier. However, those that were found to be pregnant on the ships were thrown into the ocean. Because someone bought a pregnant slave. They were considered wastes. They waste food, they waste water, they waste space. Nobody bought them. And so they were discarded. Insurance paid for it. Those who were sick and considered weak, that they would not be able to make the journey, were also thrown in. The dead followed up. So there were sharks following the ships that were feeding on them. And when there was a food shortage on board the ships, the shark that ate them was captured to feed the rest of the family on the ship. You see, these are some of the inhumane activities we are talking about. Slavery has been part of every human society, but the level of inhumanity attached to the transatlantic slavery surpasses all. And so this edifice standing continuously reminds us that never should we allow such a thing to happen again. You understand? Not only to black people, but to all races of the world. But you look at how the ventilation was designed. It's designed in big inside and then it narrows out. So if you think of trying to escape through it, you are in trouble, right? Now these cannonballs were brought in by the local fishermen. These were brought in. If you look carefully, you can see they are filled with sand. Now when captives died in the dungeons, they were parceled in a sack. Cannonballs were tied to it and they were dropped in the ocean. So I believe most of these cannonballs have sunk some of our people around our coast here, and they were brought in by the local fishermen. There's an evidence of how captives were disposed of when they passed on. First, captives were not considered as human beings, and therefore no rites were performed after their exit. They are just discarded. They are properties of somebody, and that person decides to dispose it anyhow he or she deems fit. And therefore, most often they parcel them in bags, tied cannonballs to it, and dropped it in the ocean to discast them off. So that was it. Right, so this door represents the separation of the African family. Yeah. It's the last point the Africans in the diaspora reflect onto. That's the last point they can remember, reconnect to us or with us as a people. It shows the beginning of a journey from the known to the unknown, the beginning of the ending of freedom and the beginning of slavery. Yes, the door of no return. We're going to go through it and come back. So when they came out, they were loaded into canoes like this and taken into the ships. And this was done mainly in the night, so that the residents here would not see what was happening. Although they knew, they even heard the wails and cries of the captives as they were being taken out. But to make it secured, a wall was put up around the whole harbor, up to the wharf. From the wharf to this castle was a restricted area. They called it European Beach. Abrafompano. This was the official entrance into the castle. And in front of it, we can best describe it as the arrival and departure lounge. Good. Now, between the harbor and the ships, some of them might have decided not to go. So they will just jump into the ocean, pulling the rest with them, and they will all drown here. Either they wanted to escape or just to commit suicide. So we can just imagine a morning after a departure. Bodies floating here with chains around them. So from here, they were taken to the Caribbean, the Americas, the Caribbeans, and the West Indies to work on the plantations and the mines. And across the Atlantic, one captain who was given an evidence before a fact-finding commission was asked how comfortable the captives were on board his ship. Mr. Captain, how comfortable are the captives on board your ship? His reply was that they are as comfortable as you may feel in your coffin. And the ships were described as floating coffins. They were made to lie naked on planks. And occasionally they let them out and caned them to dance for exercise. They called that dancing by the whip. All those who survived these ordeals were sold to plantation owners and miners who used them on the farms and the mines. And of course, the proceeds went into building America and Europe. And if we calculate the man-working hours of Africans that arrived alive in America, Africans will own America. Yes. But now we are begging for aids, for loans, for donations and whatnot. This is now a fishing harbor. Fishing is now the backbone of the local economy. Now we have the door of return. In 1998, 2 bodies of ex-slaves were exhumed in America and Jamaica and were brought back through this door to reverse the trend of no return so that the descendants of the survivors will come back, not necessarily through this door, but through Ghana as a gateway to West Africa. So, on behalf of the government and people of this country, everybody is welcome, especially our brothers in the diaspora who have always wanted to come home to see their motherland. You are warmly welcome. The government of Ghana is generous and has made provisions to accommodate everyone. You are warmly welcome. So, everybody is welcome, and in Ghana we say Akwaba, Akko, Abba. You have gone, you have come. Akwa, Abba. So everybody is welcome to Ghana. Yes. So we are in one of the warehouses where I don't know what's the tons or billions of gold vaults were held. Guinea gold. If you, the Danish named their currency Christianberg with gold. At a point in time, England had a coin, they call it the guinea. It was named after the gold they got from Guinea. Yes, Guinea is not the name of a country, it's a region. It's the name of West Africa, a regional name. So this was full, these rooms were full, and there are about 10 of them. Of gold, of ivory, spices, forest products, and many things that were being taken out. So this last point probably we're going to talk about is the cell. And the cell, one may ask, what's the difference between a cell and a dungeon? They are restrictive, yes, but one is more restrictive than the other. The cell was for those who persistently tried to escape, those who escaped and were rearrested, and those who were violent. They were held in it without food, water, air, or light, so they stayed in there till they died. It was divided into three. There was a door here. This section was for the soldiers who were troublesome. The third portion, come in. As you can see, there were gates here. So come in. This was a condemned cell. This was a condemned cell. The door was sealed. So those who died here, those who stayed kept here were held without food, without water, without air, without light. So they stayed here till they died. And when they died here, they brought men from the male dungeon to pack them into bags. Cannonballs were tied to it and they were dropped in the ocean. Yes, they were dropped in. This was to serve as deterrent to the others in the dungeons to not to behave the same. Right, so we are at the entrance of the church. Yes, the official English church, the Anglican church. They had a vestry and then the entrance into the church. It's now a library for children. We believe that without knowledge, our people perish. And so we then tend to inform the people. But ironically, this was a secret entrance into the dungeon. Whilst we were in the dungeon, I pointed out a hole where the captives went in to supervise and to eavesdrop on the captives, right? Some of the domestic slaves went in. This was how they got in. They got in from this point. They went in to eavesdrop from this point and directly in front of the church. So while the psalms and songs came from here, the groans and moans also came from here. You understand? Yeah. Do you know of the song Amazing Grace? Right? Amazing Grace was composed by one of the slave merchants. John Newton was the name, who came to travel to this facility several occasions. And on one of, or many times on his journey, he listened to what became known as the West African sorrow chants among the captives as they sang their way across the Atlantic into the New World. And so this inspired him to come up with that song, Amazing Grace, as we have it. And so if you go to the Library of Congress, it is recorded that the words of that song was written by John Newton, but the melody was unknown. The melodies was unknown because it came from people whose identity was stripped of their birth, their rights, and so their names were not recorded. And so these were unidentified people.
A wretch like me, I once was lost, but now was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to